What happens when a common fisherman faces death without fear? How did a violent persecutor become history's greatest missionary? These ordinary men witnessed something that transformed them completely. While hiding in fear one moment, they were boldly proclaiming truth the next, even facing torture and execution without denying their faith. Where are you watching this video from today? Let us know in the comments below. This untold journey from fear to martyrdom changed the world forever. Hit subscribe and like this video now to discover how these humble followers sparked a movement that still shapes our world 2,000 years later, in which we meet Thomas Reed and discover his emptiness. The rain fell in silver sheets across the windows of Thomas Reed's downtown apartment, refracting the city lights into kaleidoscope patterns that danced across his austere living room. At 42, Thomas had achieved everything society deemed valuable: senior partner at Meridian Consulting, a penthouse overlooking the harbor, and a reputation as the firm's most ruthless problem solver. Yet as he stood watching the storm, a tumbler of expensive whiskey cooling in his hand, he felt nothing but the familiar hollowness that had become his constant companion. His phone vibrated on the marble countertop. The caller ID displayed Claire Reed, a name he barely acknowledged anymore despite the 16 years of marriage it represented. Thomas let it ring until voicemail claimed it. Whatever crisis his estranged wife wanted to discuss about their son could wait until their scheduled Sunday call. Structure and boundaries were what kept his life manageable. Thomas turned from the window and surveyed his immaculate apartment. Every item had been selected with precision: the modernist furniture, the abstract paintings acquired from the right galleries, the rare first editions he'd never read that lined his bookshelves. Nothing out of place, nothing unexpected, nothing real. He loosened his tie and sank into his leather chair, opening his laptop to review tomorrow's presentation one final time. Meridian was pitching to acquire Hartwell Foundation, a charitable organization with significant assets that had been struggling since its founder's retirement. The board was resistant, but Thomas had developed a reputation for overcoming resistance. His strategy was flawless as always: identify the weaknesses, exploit the divisions, and position Meridian as the only solution. By this time tomorrow, another conquest would be complete. Is this really all there is? The question escaped his lips before he could trap it inside where such dangerous thoughts belonged. Thomas immediately recognized it as fatigue talking. He'd been working 70-hour weeks for months, that was all. Perhaps he should schedule that trip to Bali his assistant had been suggesting. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his son, Michael. "Dad, I know it's not Sunday, but I need to talk to you. It's important." Thomas hesitated. His relationship with his 17-year-old son had become as structured and sterile as everything else in his life. Sunday calls, monthly dinners, occasional school events when his schedule permitted. Michael had stopped trying to bridge the gap years ago. "What's going on?" he typed back, surprising himself. "I got accepted to the Hartwell Foundation Summer Fellowship, the one I told you about. Humanitarian work in Guatemala." Thomas frowned. He had no recollection of any such conversation. More concerning was the mention of Hartwell, the very organization he was dismantling tomorrow. "We need to discuss this on Sunday," he replied. "Dad, the deadline to accept is tomorrow. Mom already signed, but they need your signature too because of the travel waiver. I left the forms with your doorman 3 days ago." Thomas set down his drink. He vaguely recalled his doorman mentioning an envelope, which he'd told him to leave, with the rest of the mail. Mail he hadn't bothered to check. "I'll look for them," he wrote back, "but Michael, you should know that the Hartwell Foundation is undergoing changes. This program may not even exist by summer." The 3 dots appeared and disappeared several times before Michael's reply came through. "Of course. Wouldn't want me wasting my time helping people when I could be learning how to destroy them instead." The words struck Thomas like a physical blow. He started to type a stern response about respecting boundaries and appropriate communication, but something stopped him. Instead, he walked to his foyer and retrieved the stack of mail from the console table. Buried beneath credit card offers and magazines was a large envelope with Hartwell Foundation Fellowship Program emblazoned across the top. Thomas removed the papers and began to read. The fellowship was indeed a humanitarian program, sending exceptional high school students to work on sustainable development projects in rural Guatemala. The recommendation letters described Michael as compassionate, visionary, and committed to making a difference. A young man Thomas barely recognized from their stilted monthly dinners. Attached to the application was a personal essay Michael had written. Thomas's eyes were drawn to the opening paragraph. My earliest memory is sitting on my father's shoulders at a community garden, watching as he showed me how the smallest seeds could grow into something that nourished entire families. This is how we change the world, Mickey, he told me. One small act of growth at a time. I was only 4 when my father abandoned this philosophy for a more profitable one, but I've never forgotten that lesson, even if he has. Thomas lowered the papers, his hands trembling slightly. He remembered that day in the community garden. It was before Meridian, before he'd discovered his talent for corporate acquisitions, back when he and Claire were just starting out, living in a small apartment and volunteering weekends at the neighborhood renewal project. He couldn't recall when he'd stopped being that person or why he'd decided that power and success were more important than the things he'd once believed in. It had happened so gradually, one compromise at a time, until the man who had taught his son about changing the world had disappeared completely. Thomas glanced at his laptop, where the Hartwell acquisition presentation waited. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to look beyond the numbers to what his work actually meant. Hartwell Foundation funded dozens of programs like the one Michael wanted to join. Programs that would be eliminated once Meridian stripped the organization for its assets and tax advantages. His phone buzzed again. Just forget it, Dad, I'll find another program. Thomas stared at the message for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he closed his laptop and reached for his coat. The night doorman looked up in surprise as Thomas emerged from the elevator. Going out in this storm, Mr. Reed? Yes, James. I need to deliver these papers to my son. It's coming down pretty hard, sir. Want me to call you a car? Thomas shook his head, already moving toward the doors. No. I think I need the walk. As the cold rain hit his face, Thomas felt something stir within him, a sensation so foreign, he couldn't immediately identify it. It wasn't until he was halfway down the block, his expensive suit soaked through and his carefully styled hair plastered to his forehead, that he recognized it as possibility. The first drop of moisture in a vessel that had been dry for far too long. Chapter 2. The Unexpected Messenger, in which a stranger disrupts Thomas's carefully ordered world. The following morning, Thomas sat in his office, staring out at the harbor. He had not delivered the signed fellowship papers to Michael as he'd intended. Instead, after walking 6 blocks in the rain, he'd turned back, suddenly overwhelmed by the implications of what he was considering. The papers now lay on his desk beside the Hartwell acquisition presentation, 2 irreconcilable futures confronting him. Mr. Reed, your 9:30 is here? His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. Thomas straightened his tie. Send them. In. He expected Gerald Winters, Hartwell's interim director, a nervous academic type who'd been easy to intimidate in their previous meetings. Instead, a woman stepped into his office. She was in her 60s, with silver hair cut in a practical bob and intelligent eyes that immediately assessed him with uncomfortable precision. Mr. Reed, I'm Eleanor Hartwell. Thomas concealed his surprise as he rose to shake her hand. Ms. Hartwell, I wasn't expecting you. I understood your health had prompted your retirement from the foundation. Reports of my incapacitation have been greatly exaggerated, she said with a wry smile, settling into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. Though I admit I've been absent too long. By the time I realized what Gerald and certain board members were plotting with Meridian, things had progressed quite far. Thomas maintained his professional mask. I wouldn't characterize our discussions as a plot. Meridian can offer Hartwell Foundation financial stability and expanded reach. What Meridian offers is the dismantling of my life's work for tax advantages and real estate holdings. Eleanor's voice was calm but resolute. I've read your proposal, Mr. Reed. I know exactly what will happen to our programs under Meridian's management. Thomas picked up a pen, twirling it between his fingers, a rare outward sign of discomfort. Ms. Hartwell, business evolves. Organizations must adapt or... Spare me the corporate platitudes. She leaned forward. I didn't come here to debate. I came because I received a most unusual call last night from your son. Thomas stiffened. My son? Michael Reed. An exceptional young man. He's applied to our Guatemala fellowship program. She nodded toward the papers on his desk. He called to withdraw his application, said there was no point in pursuing it since the program would soon be eliminated. He seemed to have inside information about our negotiations. Heat rose to Thomas's face. I apologize if Michael overstepped. He shouldn't have contacted you. On the contrary, I'm glad he did. It prompted me to take a closer look at what's been happening in my absence. She studied him with unsettling intensity. Your son also said something else interesting. He said you weren't always like this. Like what? Thomas asked, his voice tight. His exact words were, my dad used to build things that helped people. Now he just tears them down for profit. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Children can be devastatingly perceptive, can't they? Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to Eleanor. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the harbor glistening in the morning sun. From this height, the water appeared pristine, though Thomas knew that at street level, industrial pollutants tainted its beauty. Ms. Hartwell, I'm not sure what you hope to accomplish by coming here. I came to look in the eyes of the man who wants to dismantle 30 years of humanitarian work, she replied simply. And I've seen something interesting there. Thomas turned. And what's that? Doubt. She rose from her chair with unexpected grace. You're very good at what you do, Mr. Reed. Your reputation precedes you. The negotiator who never blinks, never hesitates, never lets sentiment cloud his judgment. Yet here you sit with your son's fellowship application on your desk, alongside the proposal that would destroy it. If you were truly the man everyone believes you to be, there would be no conflict. Before Thomas could respond, Eleanor continued. I'm hosting a small gathering at the foundation tonight, not a fundraiser or formal event, just a celebration of our Guatemala program's 10-year anniversary. Some of our past fellows will be sharing their experiences. She placed a small cream-colored invitation on his desk. I'd like you to come. Bring Michael if he's willing. Before you dismantle something, you should at least understand what you're destroying. Ms. Hartwell, 7 o'clock, Mr. Reed, business attire, though we're not terribly formal. She moved toward the door, then paused. One last thing. Michael mentioned you once taught him that change happens one small act of growth at a time. I rather like that philosophy. After she left, Thomas sank back into his chair, the controlled environment of his office suddenly feeling stifling. He picked up the invitation, turning it over in his hands. His instinct was to discard it and proceed with the acquisition as planned. Eleanor Hartwell was clearly mounting a last-ditch emotional appeal, and Thomas Reed did not make decisions based on emotion. And yet, he reached for his phone and, after a moment's hesitation, called his son. When Michael didn't answer, he left a message. Michael, it's Dad. I met Eleanor Hartwell today. She invited us to an event at the foundation tonight. I thought, perhaps we could go together. Call me back. Thomas set down the phone, surprised by the tremor in his voice. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He cleared his afternoon schedule, telling his assistant he had a personal matter to attend to. A personal matter, sir, she'd repeated, unable to hide her shock. Yes, Ms. Winters. Something that can't wait. 2 hours later, Thomas stood outside the community garden where he'd once volunteered. The space had changed, expanded to cover what had once been an abandoned lot next door. New raised beds overflowed with early summer vegetables, and a colorful mural decorated the back wall. Children from the nearby elementary school worked alongside elderly residents, their laughter carrying across the garden. Thomas remained at the fence, an observer separated from the life within. He hadn't come to participate. He wasn't even sure why he'd come at all. But as he watched a grey-haired man showing a young girl how to transplant seedlings, something stirred in his memory. This is how we change the world, Mickey. One small act of growth at a time. His phone vibrated with a text from Michael. Why would I want to go anywhere with you? So you can explain how dismantling humanitarian programs is just good business? Thomas typed back. I haven't made any final decisions about Hartwell. I'd like you to come with me tonight, please. The reply came quickly. Fine, pick me up at 6:30, but I'm not pretending to be okay with what you're doing. Thomas pocketed his phone and took one last look at the garden. Then he turned and walked back to his car, the sensation of possibility he'd felt the night before growing stronger with each step. Chapter 3. The Veiled Invitation, in which Thomas glimpses a different path. The Hartwell Foundation headquarters occupied a restored Victorian mansion on the city's north side. As Thomas navigated his luxury sedan through the wrought iron gates, he glanced at Michael, sitting silently in the passenger seat. His son had grown several inches since Thomas had last really looked at him, his jawline sharpening into manhood. Your hair's longer, Thomas observed, attempting conversation. Michael ran a self-conscious hand through the dark waves that now fell past his collar. Mom doesn't mind it. I didn't say I minded it either. Michael gave him a skeptical look but said nothing as they pulled into a parking space. The foundation's grounds were beautifully maintained, with flowering plants surrounding a cobblestone path to the entrance. Thomas recognized the sustainable landscaping techniques, native plants requiring minimal water, arranged to prevent erosion and maximize natural pest control. It was aesthetically pleasing and environmentally responsible, the kind of thoughtful design that increased property values. Is that really your first thought? He chided himself. Assessing the real estate potential? Inside, the mansion's interior had been tastefully renovated to blend historic architecture with modern functionality. The entrance hall opened into a large reception area where perhaps 40 people mingled, sipping drinks and engaged in animated conversation. Unlike the sterile networking events Thomas usually attended, the atmosphere here was warm and genuine. Michael, you came! A young woman with curly hair and glasses approached them, her face lighting up at the sight of his son. And you must be Mr. Reed. I'm Sophie Chen, one of the program coordinators. Michael's application was outstanding. We're all hoping he'll join us in Guatemala. Thomas noticed the way Michael's posture changed in Sophie's presence. He stood, taller, more confident. Thanks, Sophie. This is my dad. He's interested in learning more about the foundation. The slight emphasis on interested was not lost on Thomas. Before he could respond, Eleanor Hartwell appeared beside them. Mr. Reed, Michael, I'm so pleased you could come. She shook Michael's hand warmly. Your essay was remarkable. We rarely see such maturity of thought in applicants your age. Michael flushed with pride. Thank you, Ms. Hartwell. Please, call me Eleanor. She turned to Thomas. We're about to begin our presentation. Would you like a tour of the facility? Afterward, I think you might find our operations more impressive than the reports suggest. Thomas nodded, hyper-aware of Michael watching this exchange. I'd appreciate that, Eleanor. They followed her to a room that had once been a grand parlor, now converted into a presentation space, with rows of chairs facing a small stage. As they took their seats, Thomas noticed photographs lining the walls, images of Hartwell projects around the world, children gathered around a newly built well in Africa, women operating a textile cooperative in Southeast Asia, medical volunteers treating patients in a remote village. The presentations began with Eleanor introducing former fellows who shared stories of their experiences. A young doctor described how her summer with Hartwell had inspired her to specialize in infectious diseases. An engineer explained how he'd helped design a sustainable irrigation system that had transformed an arid region into productive farmland. A teacher recounted establishing a literacy program that continued to thrive years after she'd left. Thomas found himself unexpectedly moved by their sincerity and by the tangible results they described. These weren't the vague, feel-good narratives typical of charitable PR. They were specific accounts of transformation supported by data and follow-up studies. Beside him, Michael leaned forward, completely engrossed. Thomas recognized the look on his son's face. It was the same expression of purpose and passion he'd seen in the mirror decades ago, before he'd convinced himself that such idealism was childish and impractical. After the presentations, Eleanor led them through the Foundation's offices. Thomas was impressed despite himself. The organization operated with remarkable efficiency, with clear metrics for measuring program effectiveness and systems for ensuring accountability at every level. "You see, Mr. Reed," Eleanor explained as they examined a project management board, "we run this foundation with the same rigor as any successful business. The difference is in our definition of profit." "Meaning?" Thomas asked. "Our return on investment isn't measured in dollars, but in human potential unlocked." She gestured to a map dotted with colored pins. "Each pin represents a community that's achieved self-sufficiency through one of our programs. Once they no longer need our assistance, we redirect resources to new communities. It's sustainable impact, expanding outward like ripples in a pond." Thomas recognized the strategy. It was smart, scalable, and meticulously executed. If Hartwell had been a corporation, its methodology would have been worthy of a business school case study. "Why let things get to this point?" he asked quietly, ensuring Michael was engaged with Sophie across the room before continuing. "If the foundation is this well run, how did it become vulnerable to acquisition?" Eleanor's expression clouded. "That's a fair question. The truth is, I became seriously ill 2 years ago. During my recovery, I delegated too much authority to board members who didn't share my vision. They saw our endowment and real estate holdings as underperforming assets. By the time I returned, they'd already engaged with Meridian." She met his eyes directly. "And they found the perfect negotiator in you, someone who would execute the deal efficiently without asking too many questions about what would be lost." The accusation stung because Thomas recognized its truth. He had approached Hartwell like any other acquisition, focusing on assets and legalities, never considering the human cost of its dismantling. "And now?" Eleanor asked. "Having seen what we do you still believe Meridian's ownership would be in the best interest of those we serve?" Before Thomas could answer, Sophie called them over. "Michael was just telling me about his ideas for expanding our educational component in Guatemala. He has some brilliant concepts for addressing literacy while respecting indigenous knowledge systems." Thomas watched as Michael explained his thoughts, his hands moving expressively, his face animated with an enthusiasm Thomas hadn't witnessed in years. This was a side of his son he barely recognized, passionate, articulate, filled with purpose. "The Foundation has been developing similar approaches in other regions," Eleanor told Michael. "I'd like to introduce you to our education director before you leave. Your perspective could be valuable to our planning for next year's program." "Next year?" Michael glanced at his father. "Is there going to be a next year?" The question hung in the air, and Thomas felt the weight of every person's gaze. In that moment, he understood what Eleanor had orchestrated. This wasn't just a tour or a celebration. It was a choice placed before him, unavoidable and stark. "That remains to be seen," he said carefully, unwilling to commit himself in either direction. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor handed Thomas a file. "These are the 5-year impact reports for our major programs. Numbers, data, measurable outcomes, the language I think you'll find most persuasive. Take them, read them, then decide if what we've built is worth preserving." In the car, Michael finally broke his silence. "You're really going through with it, aren't you? You're going to help Meridian shut them down." Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "It's complicated, Michael." "No, it's not," his son retorted. "You saw what they do. How can you pretend this is just another business deal?" "Because it is a business deal," Thomas replied, his professional mask slipping back into place. "Emotion doesn't factor into it." Michael laughed bitterly. "Right. I forgot who I was talking to for a minute." He stared out the window. "Just drop me at Mom's. I don't want to go back to your place." Thomas felt something crack inside him, a hairline fracture in the carapace he'd built around himself. "Michael, Save it, Dad. You made your choice. A long time ago. Tonight just reminded me of that." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the file from Eleanor sitting heavily between them. Chapter 4. The fractured mirror in which Thomas confronts reflections of his past and present. The morning of the Hartwell acquisition meeting, Thomas stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with mechanical precision. The face that stared back at him seemed suddenly unfamiliar, the lines around his eyes deeper, the set of his mouth harder than he remembered. A memory surfaced. Himself at 25, standing before a different mirror in a cramped apartment bathroom, Claire helping him straighten his tie before his first day at Meridian. "You're going to change the world someday, Thomas Reed," she'd said, her eyes bright with belief in him. "I just know it." He'd believed it too back then, had seen the corporate position as a stepping stone to greater influence, a way to eventually fund the humanitarian work he'd dreamed of doing. When had the stepping stone become the destination? When had he stopped questioning the path he was on? On his nightstand, Eleanor's file lay open beside the Hartwell acquisition presentation he'd revised until 3 a.m. He'd spent hours reading through the impact reports, verifying the Foundation's claims against independent sources. The evidence was irrefutable. Hartwell's programs were effective, sustainable, and life-changing for the communities they served. And yet, he'd still prepared the acquisition presentation, had refined his arguments, anticipated objections, developed contingency strategies. Because that was what Thomas Reed did. He completed the mission regardless of personal feelings. Feelings were irrelevant to success. His phone chimed with a text from Claire. "Michael told me about last night. Call me before the meeting, Thomas. Please." Thomas ignored it and gathered his materials. In the kitchen, he started to prepare his usual breakfast smoothie, then abandoned it half-made. Food held no appeal. Instead, he found himself driving toward the office via an unfamiliar route, one that took him past his old neighborhood. The modest row house where he and Claire had started their marriage looked smaller than he remembered. Their tiny front yard, once overgrown with Claire's experimental vegetable garden, was now neatly manicured with ornamental shrubs. Thomas slowed the car, recalling summer evenings on the porch, planning their future while watching fireflies rise from the grass. He'd been a different man then. Idealistic, yes, but also more alive, more present in his own life. When had he stopped noticing fireflies and started calculating compound interest instead? At a red light, Thomas's gaze fell on a small community center across the street. A familiar logo caught his eye. A stylized tree with outstretched branches. The Hartwell Foundation. A banner announced a free health clinic taking place that very morning. Without conscious decision, Thomas pulled into the parking lot. Inside, the community center hummed with activity. Medical volunteers in scrubs moved efficiently between makeshift examination rooms. Families waited on folding chairs, children playing with donated toys in a supervised corner. "Can I help you?" A volunteer approached, clipboard in hand. Thomas straightened his suit jacket, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. "I'm just observing. Is this a Hartwell Foundation program?" "Yes, the monthly clinic. We provide basic health care, screenings, and medication assistance for uninsured families." She smiled. "Are you interested in volunteering? We can always use administrative help." "No, I have a meeting." Thomas stepped back, the volunteer's assumption that he might want to help striking him like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had seen him as someone who might contribute something other than strategic business advice? As he turned to leave, he noticed a familiar face. Sophie Chen, the program coordinator he'd met the previous evening. She was kneeling beside an elderly woman, speaking gently as she helped her fill out forms. Thomas attempted to slip out unnoticed, but Sophie looked up and caught his eye. After saying something reassuring to the elderly woman, she approached him, her expression curious. "Mr. Reed? This is unexpected." "I was just passing by," he explained awkwardly. "I didn't realize Hartwell operated programs locally as well as internationally." "We're in 37 communities across the city," Sophie said. "This clinic serves about 200 families each month." She studied him. "Your meeting with the board is today, isn't it?" He nodded, uncomfortable under her gaze. "Can I show you something before you go?" Without waiting for his response, Sophie led him to a bulletin board covered with photographs. "This is why we do what we do." The photos showed people of all ages, their faces shining with pride and accomplishment. Handwritten captions detailed their achievements: graduating from nursing school, opening small businesses, completing GED programs. Every person here came through a Hartwell program, Sophie explained. They're not just statistics, their lives transformed, including mine. She pointed to a photo of a younger version of herself, standing with a group of teenagers in front of what looked like a science lab. I grew up in foster care, bouncing between homes. Hartwell's STEM program gave me stability, mentorship, and a future I couldn't have imagined. Now I pay that forward. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement of values long buried. "Mr. Reed, may I speak frankly?" Sophie asked. He nodded, strangely eager for whatever she might say. "Michael talks about you all the time. Not the current you, the you from his childhood, the one who taught him to care about making a difference." Her eyes were kind but determined. "That version of you still exists. I saw glimpses of him last night when you were watching the presentations. He's in there, buried under whatever convinced you that acquisition metrics matter more than human lives." Thomas started to offer his standard response about business realities, but the words died in his throat. Standing in this room, surrounded by evidence of lives changed through the very organization he planned to dismantle, the professional language felt hollow. "I have a meeting to get to," he said instead, his voice rough. "Of course." Sophie handed him a pamphlet, "In case you wanted to know more about our local programs." Back in his car, Thomas sat with the engine off, staring at the pamphlet. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from his team wondering where he was. The acquisition meeting was scheduled to start in 30 minutes. With sudden decision, Thomas started the car and drove, not toward his office, but to Claire's house in the suburbs. He needed to speak with Michael before he walked into that meeting. Claire answered the door, her surprise evident. "Thomas, shouldn't you be at work?" "I need to talk to Michael," he said. "Is he home?" "He left for school an hour ago." She studied his face. "You look terrible. What's going on?" Thomas hesitated, then asked, "Could I come in for a minute?" Claire's kitchen was warm and lived in, so different from his sterile apartment. Family photos lined the refrigerator, Michael through the years, Claire with her. New husband Daniel, holiday gatherings Thomas had missed. He felt like a ghost haunting a life that had continued without him. "Coffee?" Claire offered. He nodded, sinking into a chair at the familiar oak table where they'd once shared meals as a family. Claire placed a mug in front of him and sat down across from him, waiting. "I don't know what to do," Thomas finally said, the admission costing him more than any financial concession ever had. Claire's expression softened. "About Hartwell?" "About everything." He wrapped his hands around the warm mug. "I'm supposed to be in a meeting right now, finalizing an acquisition that will effectively dismantle the Hartwell Foundation. It's a good deal for Meridian. The board will be thrilled." "And you won't be," Claire said simply. Thomas looked up, startled by her perception. "I used to know exactly what I wanted. Success, advancement, security. Those weren't always your definitions of success," Claire reminded him gently. "You used to want to make a difference, to help people who needed it." She reached across the table and touched his hand, the first physical contact between them in years. "The Thomas Reed I married wouldn't be sitting in my kitchen having an existential crisis about dismantling a humanitarian organization. He'd be figuring out how to save it." "That Thomas Reed was naive," he said, but without conviction. "That Thomas Reed was the best man I've ever known." Claire withdrew her hand. "He's also the father Michael desperately wishes he still had." Thomas winced. "Michael hates me." "No," Claire corrected. "He's angry and disappointed. There's a difference. He still talks about the dad who carried him on his shoulders and taught him about changing the world. That memory sustains him, even as the current reality breaks his heart." Thomas checked his watch. The meeting had started without him. His phone had gone silent. Likely his team had given up trying to reach him and proceeded as planned. "I have to go," he said, standing abruptly. Claire looked up at him, her eyes full of an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "What are you going to do, Thomas?" "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. "But I think I need to find out if that version of me still exists." As he drove toward Meridian's offices, Thomas felt as though he were seeing the city with new eyes. The gleaming corporate towers that had once represented achievement now looked cold and disconnected from the life teeming in the streets below. The communities he'd driven past without noticing for years suddenly came into focus, their struggles and resilience visible if one only chose to look. By the time he parked in his reserved space, Thomas had made his decision. He just hoped it wasn't too late. Chapter 5. The precipice in which Thomas takes a stand and faces the consequences. Thomas entered the Meridian conference room 45 minutes late, interrupting his deputy Marcus Blackwell mid-presentation. The faces around the table turned. Toward him, his team showing surprise and relief, the Hartwell board members with varying expressions of impatience and curiosity. At the far end sat Eleanor Hartwell, her eyes alert and knowing. "Thomas, there you are," said Victor Crane, Meridian's CEO, with barely concealed irritation. "We were beginning to think you'd abandoned us. Marcus has been handling the presentation admirably in your absence. My apologies for the delay," Thomas said, remaining standing rather than taking his usual seat at Victor's right hand. Something urgent required my attention. He scanned the room, registering the polished PowerPoint slide on the display, a sleek visualization of how Hartwell's assets would be redistributed under Meridian management. His own work, prepared meticulously over the past weeks. "Marcus, could you return to the beginning of the presentation, please?" Thomas requested. Marcus looked to Victor for approval, then complied, clicking back to the opening slide. Hartwell, Foundation Acquisition, Maximizing Value Through Strategic Integration. Thomas took a deep breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience. Before we proceed further, I need to make a statement." Victor frowned. "Thomas, we've already covered the introductions. Perhaps you could review the minutes and catch up. I cannot in good conscience recommend that this acquisition proceed as planned," Thomas interrupted, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. The room went silent. Thomas felt a curious lightness, as though he'd set down a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten its weight. "I've spent the past 24 hours reviewing the Hartwell Foundation's operations, programs, and impact metrics," he continued. "My conclusion is that the Foundation is not only fulfilling its mission with remarkable efficiency, but creating value that cannot be replicated or improved upon through corporate restructuring." Victor's face had gone rigid. "Thomas, what are you doing?" "My job, Victor," Thomas replied. "You asked me to determine the best approach for this acquisition. After thorough analysis, I'm advising against it." He reached into his briefcase and removed a folder, not the acquisition presentation, but the alternative proposal he'd drafted in his car before entering the building. "Instead, I'm proposing a strategic partnership between Meridian and Hartwell, one that preserves the Foundation's operational independence while providing Meridian with significant tax advantages and corporate social responsibility benefits." He distributed copies of the proposal. "You'll find that this approach actually offers Meridian better long-term financial outcomes while maintaining Hartwell's humanitarian programs intact. It's a rare situation where doing the right thing also happens to be the most profitable course of action." Gerald Winters, Hartwell's interim director who had originally approached Meridian, sputtered, "This isn't what we agreed to. The board voted based on incomplete information." Thomas interrupted. "And without full participation." He nodded toward Eleanor. "I believe if presented with a viable alternative to complete acquisition, they would reconsider." Eleanor smiled, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I'm certainly open to exploring alternatives that preserve our mission." Victor Crane stood, his face flushed with anger. "Thomas, a word outside. Now." In the hallway, Victor rounded on him. "What the hell do you think you're doing? This deal was practically closed." "I'm proposing a better alternative," Thomas replied, maintaining his composure. "If you review the numbers—" "I don't give a damn about your numbers," Victor hissed. "This isn't about bottom-line profit. Donovan wants Hartwell's property holdings for the Riverside Development Project. The board has already green-lit preliminary designs." Thomas felt a wave of disgust. The Riverside Development, luxury condominiums and high-end retail, had been presented as a separate initiative. He hadn't realized Hartwell's acquisition was connected to it. You never mentioned Riverside in our planning meetings, he said, quietly. Need-to-know basis, Victor replied dismissively. Your job was to close the acquisition cleanly, not ask questions or develop a sudden conscience. Thomas straightened. Then perhaps I'm not the right person for this job anymore. Victor's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening to resign over a charity? He laughed incredulously. Thomas, be reasonable. You've built a career here. You're next in line for executive vice president when Harrison retires next year. The promise of advancement, what Thomas had worked toward for 2 decades, suddenly felt hollow. I can't do this, Victor, not anymore. Fine. Take the rest of the day off. Clear your head. Victor's tone softened to false concern. You've been working too hard. Go home, have a drink, remember what team you're on, I'll salvage the meeting. No, Thomas's voice was firm. I'm not stepping aside. I'm going back in there to present my partnership proposal. If Meridian won't consider it, I'll resign effective immediately and offer my services to Hartwell to help them fight this acquisition. Victor's face transformed, the mask of mentorship falling away completely. You do that and you'll never work in corporate finance again. I'll personally see to it that your reputation is destroyed. Maybe that wouldn't be such a terrible thing, Thomas replied, surprised by the calm certainty he felt. He turned and walked back into the conference room. For the next 2 hours, Thomas presented his partnership proposal with the same precision and persuasiveness that had made him Meridian's top negotiator. He answered questions, addressed concerns, and slowly, visibly brought most of the Hartwell board members around to his perspective. Victor remained silent throughout, his expression glacial. When the meeting finally adjourned, no formal decision had been made, but Thomas had accomplished his immediate goal, stalling the acquisition and creating a viable alternative. The Hartwell board would reconvene the following week to vote on both options. As the room emptied, Eleanor approached him. That was quite a performance, Mr. Reed. Not a performance, Thomas corrected her. Just the truth, for once. Truth has consequences, she observed, glancing toward Victor engaged in intense conversation with Gerald Winters across the room. Are you prepared for them? I don't know, Thomas admitted, but I couldn't do it anymore. Reduce everything to assets. And liabilities, ignore the human cost. He hesitated, then added, My son helped me see that. Eleanor nodded. Children often remind us of our better selves. She handed him her card. Call me tomorrow. Regardless of what Meridian decides, I think you and I have more to discuss. Thomas returned to his office to find his assistant, Patricia, waiting anxiously. Mr. Reed, HR called. They need to see you immediately. He nodded, unsurprised. Thank you, Patricia. You've been an excellent assistant. I should have told you that more often. Her eyes widened. Sir, are you probably being fired, yes? Thomas managed to smile. It was bound to happen eventually. Perhaps not quite this dramatically, but... His phone chimed with a text from Michael. Mom told me you stopped by this morning. What's going on? Thomas typed back. I just walked away from the biggest deal of my career because it was the wrong thing to do. Not sure if I've still got a job. Can I come by after school? I'd like to talk. The response came quickly. Seriously? Yes, I'll be home at 3:30. Thomas slipped his phone into his pocket and headed to HR. By noon, his company keycard had been deactivated, his personal items had been boxed, and security had escorted him to the lobby. 22 years at Meridian ended in 45 minutes of procedural formalities. Standing on the sidewalk outside the gleaming tower that had defined his identity for so long, Thomas felt strangely unburdened. He hailed a taxi, but instead of giving his apartment address, he directed the driver to the community center he'd visited that morning. The health clinic was still in session. Thomas approached the volunteer desk. Excuse me, is Sophie Chen still here? The volunteer pointed toward a back office. She's finishing up some paperwork. Sophie looked up in surprise when Thomas knocked on her open door. Mr. Reed? I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Neither did I, he admitted. But it seems I suddenly have some free time on my hands. What happened? I chose a different path. Thomas hesitated. You mentioned earlier that you could use administrative help. Is that offer still open? Sophie studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "We can always use another set of hands, but aren't you a bit overqualified?" "Actually," Thomas said, "I think I'm just now becoming qualified for the things that truly matter." Chapter 6. The Hollow Crown. In which Thomas confronts the emptiness of his former life, rain pounded against the windows of Thomas's penthouse as he methodically sorted through the possessions that had defined his life. 2 weeks had passed since his departure from Meridian. The first few days had been a blur of legal consultations, reviewing his non-compete agreement, negotiating his severance package, transferring his clients to other managers. Victor had made good on his threat. Through industry connections, Thomas learned that his former mentor was spreading rumors about his mental breakdown and ethical lapses. Several potential employers had already cancelled preliminary interviews. His professional reputation, built meticulously over decades, was being systematically dismantled. Strangely, Thomas found he cared less than expected. The competitive drive that had once consumed him had been replaced by something quieter but more substantial. He'd spent the past week volunteering at Hartwell's community center, helping Sophie reorganize their outdated filing system and providing financial counseling to program participants. The work was unglamorous and paid nothing, yet each evening he returned home feeling something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of genuine accomplishment. Now, as thunder cracked overhead, Thomas surveyed his apartment with new eyes. The expensive furniture, the carefully curated art collection, the rare wines, all of it suddenly seemed like props on a stage, creating the illusion of a meaningful life rather than supporting one. He picked up a crystal award from his bookshelf, Financial Strategist of the Year, and tried to recall the ceremony where he'd received it. The memory was hazy, overshadowed by the acquisition he'd been working on at the time. Had he even given an acceptance speech? Had Claire and Michael attended? He couldn't remember. Thomas placed the award in a box labeled Storage, alongside similar trophies and plaques. His phone rang. Eleanor Hartwell's name appeared on the screen. "Thomas, good evening. Have you given any more thought to our conversation?" Earlier, that week, Eleanor had approached him with an unexpected proposal. Hartwell's board had voted against Meridian's acquisition offer, embracing instead the partnership model Thomas had proposed. Now they needed someone to implement it, someone who understood both corporate finance and humanitarian priorities. "I've been thinking about nothing else," Thomas admitted, "but I'm not sure I'm the right person. My background is in acquisitions, not non-profit management." "That's precisely why you're perfect for this role," Eleanor countered. "You understand the corporate world's language and priorities, but you've also demonstrated commitment to our mission. Besides, the skill set isn't so different. Strategic planning, resource allocation, stakeholder management. You'd simply be measuring success by different metrics." Thomas glanced around his apartment. It would mean a significant salary reduction. "Yes," Eleanor acknowledged, "though perhaps not as drastic as you might think. Contrary to popular belief, we do compensate our executives competitively. We simply don't believe in the excessive disparities common in the corporate world." Thomas thought of the community center, of the faces brightening when someone finally took time to listen to their challenges. He thought of Michael's expression when Thomas had told him about standing up to Victor, a mixture of disbelief and fragile hope. "So I'd like to accept the position," he said finally, "but I need to make some life changes first. Could we meet next week to discuss details?" After ending the call, Thomas resumed his sorting with renewed purpose. The keep pile remained small. Books he'd actually read and valued, family photographs he'd neglected to display, a few pieces of art chosen for personal connection rather than investment potential. Everything else would be sold, stored, or donated. His doorbell rang, an unusual occurrence at his security-controlled building. The intercom revealed his visitor to be Claire. "I was in the neighborhood," she explained when he let her in, though they both knew the downtown penthouse was nowhere near her suburban routine. She surveyed the boxes scattered across his living room. "Spring cleaning?" "Life cleaning," Thomas replied. "I'm considering a change of address." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Does this have anything to do with your sudden career change? Michael told me what happened at Meridian. It sounded Unlike you. At least, unlike the you of recent years. Thomas offered her a seat and, at her request, a glass of water. I've been wondering the same thing. Was it unlike me or unlike who I'd become? He settled into the chair opposite her. Why are you really here, Claire? She took a moment before answering. Michael's different since your talk, happier, more like his old self. She set down her glass. He told me you've been volunteering at Hartwell. Thomas nodded. 3 days a week. I'm also helping some of the program participants with financial literacy, basic budgeting, debt management, that sort of thing. That sounds like the Thomas I used to know. Claire's voice was soft, reflective. The one who believed business, skills could be used to help people, not just generate profit. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, the weight of years of divergent paths and unspoken regrets. I've been offered a position at Hartwell, Thomas finally said. Chief of Strategic Partnerships. I'd be responsible for developing the corporate partnership program I proposed, starting with Meridian. Are you going to take it? Yes. The certainty in his voice surprised even him. I need to do something meaningful with whatever time I have left, something Michael can be proud of. Claire studied him. This isn't just about Michael, though, is it? No, Thomas admitted. It's about finding my way back to the person I meant to be, before I got lost in promotions and performance bonuses and corner offices. He gestured around the apartment. All this, it never made me happy. I just convinced myself it should. And now? Now I'm starting over, he smiled ruefully. At 42, with a professional reputation in tatters and a significantly reduced earning potential. Claire laughed softly. Sounds terrifying and exhilarating. Both, Thomas agreed. Definitely both. They talked for another hour, not as estranged spouses rehashing old grievances, but as two people who once shared dreams reconnecting, over values they still held in common. When Claire left, she paused at the door. Daniel and I host a family dinner every Sunday. Michael would love it if you'd join us sometimes. So would I. Thomas felt something warm unfurl in his chest. I'd like that. After she left, Thomas continued sorting his possessions with greater clarity. The storm outside had passed, leaving the city washed clean and glistening in the evening light. He opened the balcony door and stepped outside, breathing deeply. From this height, the city spread out before him like a vast, interconnected organism. Lights flickered on as darkness fell, each one representing lives being lived, challenges faced, possibilities embraced or abandoned. Somewhere out there was the community garden, where he'd once lifted Michael onto his shoulders. Somewhere else was the Hartwell Community Center, where his new path was taking shape. Thomas hadn't felt this alive, this present in his own existence in years. The future remained uncertain. His savings would sustain him for a while, but eventually he would need to adapt to a more modest lifestyle. His professional connections might never recover from Victor's campaign against him. The path ahead would not be easy. Yet as he watched the city lights shimmer against the darkening sky, Thomas felt for the first time in decades that he was exactly where he needed to be, not at the pinnacle of a hollow achievement, but at the beginning of something authentic and true. Chapter 7. The redemptive path in which Thomas builds a new foundation through acts of restoration. 3 months later, Thomas stood in the doorway of his new office at the Hartwell Foundation headquarters. The space was modest compared to his former domain at Meridian, perhaps a quarter of the size, with simple furnishings and walls adorned with photographs of Hartwell projects around the world. Yet it felt more like home than the corner office he'd occupied for 15 years. His desk was covered with partnership proposals and implementation plans. The strategic partnership program had gained momentum faster than anyone anticipated. After Meridian reluctantly signed on, more to avoid negative publicity than from genuine conviction, 3 other corporations had approached Hartwell with similar interests. Thomas's corporate experience proved invaluable in translating between the humanitarian and business worlds, finding common ground where others saw only irreconcilable differences. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Sophie Chen entered, carrying a stack of folders. "The Community Center Renovation Committee is meeting in 10 minutes, she reminded him. And these just came in from the Guatemala program coordinator. Michael asked me to make sure you got them before the board presentation tomorrow. Thomas smiled at the mention of his son. Michael had accepted the Guatemala Fellowship and spent 6 weeks helping implement sustainable agriculture projects in rural communities. He'd returned transformed, more confident, more purposeful, and most significantly for Thomas, more willing to rebuild their relationship. Thanks, Sophie. How are the literacy program numbers looking? 30% improvement in completion rates since we implemented your budgeting incentive structure, she reported with evident satisfaction. The financial literacy component is making a real difference. Participants say it gives them practical tools alongside the educational ones. After Sophie left, Thomas opened the Guatemala files. Among the impact reports and budget projections was a handwritten note from Michael. Dad thought you'd want to see these before the board meeting. The sustainable irrigation system we helped install is already increasing crop yields by 15%. The families in San Marcos village are projecting food security through next year's dry season for the first time in a decade. Also, I got my acceptance letter from Georgetown yesterday. The admissions officer specifically mentioned my Hartwell Fellowship experience. Looks like I'll be starting their global development program next fall. See you Sunday for dinner. Michael Thomas felt a rush of pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. His son was forging his own path, one aligned with values Thomas had once embraced and was now rediscovering. He tucked the note into his jacket pocket as he gathered his materials for the renovation committee meeting. The community center project had become his passion, transforming the aging facility into a comprehensive resource hub while keeping it operational throughout the renovation process. It required all his strategic planning skills, but with an entirely different goal than maximizing shareholder value. As he crossed the grounds toward the main building, Thomas noticed Eleanor Hartwell sitting on a bench in the garden, deep in conversation with a woman he didn't recognize. Eleanor waved him over. Thomas, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet Josephine Kimathi. She runs our agricultural development programs in East Africa. The woman rose to shake his hand. With her warm smile and firm handshake, Josephine exuded quiet competence. Mr. Reed, Eleanor speaks highly of your work here. Please, it's Thomas, and I'm still learning. Learning is the essence of growth, Josephine replied. Eleanor tells me you're developing a model where businesses contribute more than just funding to humanitarian work. Thomas nodded. The traditional corporate donation model creates dependency and allows businesses to check a social responsibility box without meaningful engagement. We're building partnerships where companies contribute expertise, technology, and human resources alongside financial support. It creates deeper investment in outcomes and sustainability. That's exactly the approach we need in Kenya, Josephine said. Would you be interested in consulting on our corporate engagement strategy? We've had interest from several agribusiness companies, but I'm wary of partnerships that might undermine local farmers. Thomas glanced at Eleanor, who smiled encouragingly. I think that could be arranged, perhaps after the community center renovation is further along. The meeting that followed embodied everything Thomas had come to value about his new work. Unlike corporate meetings focused on hierarchy and political positioning, this group, composed of staff, volunteers, and community members, concentrated entirely on creating the best possible facility to serve real human needs. Every decision balanced fiscal responsibility with mission effectiveness. People disagreed openly but respectfully, united by shared purpose rather than self-interest. Afterward, Thomas drove to the suburbs for his now regular Sunday dinner with Claire, Daniel, and Michael. These gatherings had initially been awkward, but over weeks a new dynamic had emerged. Daniel, an environmental science professor, had proven unexpectedly welcoming. Perhaps because Thomas was no longer the intimidating corporate titan Claire had divorced, but a man sincerely trying to rebuild what mattered. Tonight's dinner had special significance. Michael had requested that Thomas arrive early to help prepare the meal, a rare opportunity for father-son time. I'm thinking of taking a gap year before college, Michael announced as they chopped vegetables side by side in Claire's kitchen. To work with Josephine in Kenya. She's developing an agricultural training program that combines traditional farming knowledge with sustainable technologies. Thomas carefully kept his expression neutral. That sounds like an incredible opportunity, but I thought you were excited about Georgetown. I am, Michael assured him. They'll defer my admission. I just keep thinking about something Eleanor said, that education should be a dialogue between theory and practice. He glanced at his father. What do you think? The old Thomas would have discouraged such a detour from the conventional path to success. The new Thomas considered his son's question carefully. I think you should follow what calls to you most strongly, he finally said. Georgetown will still be there after a year, but this particular opportunity might not be. And the perspective you'll gain could make your formal education more meaningful. Michael looked surprised, then pleased. That's what I was thinking too. I just wasn't sure you'd see it that way. I'm learning to see a lot of things differently, Thomas admitted. Sometimes I wonder where I'd be if I'd taken a gap year instead of charging straight from college to business school to Meridian. Probably not making stir-fry with your son on a Sunday afternoon, Michael observed with a grin. Later, as the four of them sat around Claire's dining table sharing the meal and conversation, Thomas felt a sense of peace he'd almost forgotten was possible. This wasn't the life he'd planned, not the achievements he'd pursued so single-mindedly for decades. It was something simpler and infinitely more precious: human connection, purpose, and the chance to repair what had been broken. Claire caught his eye across the table and smiled slightly, as if reading his thoughts. They had found their way to friendship again, bound by their shared love for Michael and newfound respect for each other's paths. That night, driving back to his new apartment, a modest two-bedroom in a diverse neighborhood near the Hartwell Community Center, Thomas reflected on the transformation of the past months. He'd traded status for purpose, accumulation for contribution, isolation for community. The transition hadn't been without challenges. His savings had diminished faster than anticipated. Former colleagues avoided him at social functions. Victor, Crane had apparently made it his personal mission to undermine Thomas's credibility in business circles. Yet none of this troubled him, as it once would have. The metrics by which he measured his life had fundamentally changed. Success was no longer defined by his bank balance or job title, but by the relationships he was rebuilding and the lives touched by his work. As he parked outside his apartment building, Thomas noticed his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Castillo, struggling with her groceries. 3 months ago, he wouldn't have seen her at all, too preoccupied with his own concerns. Now he hurried to help, carrying her bags and listening to her stories about her grandchildren as they climbed the stairs together. It was in these small moments, helping a neighbor, mentoring a program participant, rebuilding trust with his son, that Thomas was reconstructing his life, one human connection at a time. The path ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was aligned with his truest self, the self he'd nearly lost in pursuit of hollow success. Chapter 8. The Awakening, in which Thomas embraces his authentic purpose and a new beginning. 1 year to the day after his departure from Meridian, Thomas stood beneath a canopy of stars in rural Kenya. The night air carried the scents of earth and eucalyptus, so different from the climate-controlled sterility of his former life. Nearby, a bonfire illuminated the faces of farmers gathered to celebrate the harvest, the first successful one after 3 years of drought and crop failures. Josephine Kimathi stood beside him, pride evident in her stance as she surveyed the celebration. 6 months ago, these families were facing starvation. Now they're planning for surplus. Thomas nodded, still amazed by the transformation he'd witnessed. What had begun as a consulting trip to help Josephine structure corporate partnerships had evolved into a 3-month assignment. The partnership model they'd developed had brought together an agricultural technology company, a regional university, and local farming cooperatives in a collaboration that respected indigenous knowledge while introducing sustainable innovations. "Your son has become quite the diplomat," Josephine observed, gesturing toward Michael, who sat cross-legged among a group of young farmers, deep in animated conversation. "The elders respect him because he listens before he speaks." "A quality he certainly didn't inherit from me," Thomas admitted. At least not the version of me he grew up with. People change, Josephine said simply, when they allow themselves to be transformed by truth. The truth that had transformed Thomas continued to unfold daily. His role at Hartwell had expanded beyond the Strategic Partnerships program. Eleanor had appointed him to the senior leadership team, where his business acumen helped strengthen the organization's sustainability while preserving its humanitarian mission. The community center renovation had been completed under budget and ahead of schedule, now serving twice as many families with enhanced programs. The financial literacy workshops Thomas had started had expanded to 5 locations, with demonstrable impacts on participants' economic stability. Yet the most significant transformation remained personal. The hollow vessel Thomas had been a year ago had filled with purpose, connection, and genuine joy. The restless ambition that had driven him to sacrifice everything meaningful for professional advancement had been replaced by a deeper motivation to use his skills and experience in service to others. Her familiar figure approached through the darkness, Eleanor, who had arrived in Kenya that morning for the harvest celebration and to review the partnership program's progress. "Quite different from the Meridian boardroom, isn't it?" she observed, joining Thomas and Josephine. "In every conceivable way," Thomas agreed. "I received an interesting call yesterday," Eleanor continued, "from Victor Crane." Thomas raised an eyebrow. He hadn't spoken to his former mentor since leaving Meridian. Apparently, Meridian's attempting a major expansion into emerging markets, Eleanor explained. They're encountering resistance from communities concerned about exploitation. Victor wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on their community engagement strategy. Thomas couldn't help laughing. He spent months destroying my professional reputation, and now he wants my help. "Desperation makes for strange reconnections," Eleanor said with a smile. "The Hartwell partnership has given Meridian considerable, positive publicity. Other corporations have noticed. Victor's board is pressing him to replicate that success." Thomas gazed at the celebration, where Michael was now teaching a group of children a game he'd invented. "What did you tell him?" "That any consulting arrangement would need to include genuine community benefit, substantial local ownership, and adherence to ethical standards that Meridian has historically ignored. Also, that your fee would be entirely donated to Hartwell's educational programs." Eleanor's eyes twinkled. He didn't sound enthused, but he didn't say no. The conversation turned to other matters, but Thomas found himself reflecting on the irony of Victor's request. A year ago, he would have viewed such an opportunity as vindication, a chance to prove his worth to those who had discarded him. Now he recognized it as something else entirely, an opportunity to extend the principles he'd embraced beyond Hartwell's immediate sphere, to influence an organization that impacted thousands of lives through its business practices. Later that evening, Thomas found a quiet spot away from the celebration. The Kenyan night sky blazed with stars in patterns unfamiliar to his North American eyes. He took out his phone, opened his journaling app and began to write, a habit he'd developed over the past year to document his journey and clarify his thoughts. "1 year ago today, I thought I'd lost everything that defined me. My career, my professional reputation, my identity as a successful man. What I couldn't see then was that I had actually found myself for the first time in decades. The man I was had been hollowed out by pursuit of achievements that meant nothing beyond the moment of acquisition. The titles, the bonuses, the recognition, none of it filled the emptiness I carried. Truth arrived in unexpected forms. My son's essay about who I used to be, Eleanor's challenge to see beyond balance sheets, Sophie's quiet demonstration of purpose, Josephine's wisdom about growth through learning. Each messenger offered a piece of the path back to authenticity. What I've discovered is that meaning isn't found in accumulation but in contribution, not in power over others but in empowering them, not in isolation at the top but in connection within community. I don't know what lies ahead, whether Victor's request represents a genuine opportunity for broader change or just another corporate maneuver, whether the partnership model we're building will transform how business and humanitarian work intersect or remain a small-scale experiment. whether my relationship with Michael will continue to heal and strengthen. What I do know is that I'm finally awake, present in my own life. Aligned with my deepest values, the path forward isn't clearly marked, but for the first time in years I trust myself to navigate it authentically, one choice at a time. Thomas set down his phone and looked up at the stars again. The vastness above him no longer seemed threatening in its enormity, but comforting in its constancy. He thought of the ancient farmers who had used these same stars to guide their plantings and harvests, finding meaning in the cycles of growth and renewal. A voice called his name. Michael was approaching, silhouetted against the distant bonfire. "Everyone's asking for you," his son said. "The elders want you to join the circle for the storytelling." Thomas rose and placed his hand on Michael's shoulder. "Lead the way." As they walked back toward the celebration, father and son fell into easy conversation about the sustainable irrigation system they'd helped implement, the university partnerships Michael was developing, his upcoming studies at Georgetown. No tension, no judgment, no carefully maintained distance, just two men sharing a path of purpose, each respecting the other's journey. The bonfire came into view, encircled by community members of all ages. Josephine waved them over to spaces saved in the circle. As they settled onto woven mats, an elder began a traditional story of transformation, of how a barren field became fertile again through the combined wisdom of the community. Thomas listened, absorbing the elder's words and the expressions on the faces around the circle. He recognized in this gathering the true wealth he'd been seeking all along, connection to others, meaningful work, and the knowledge that his presence in the world contributed something of value. The hollow vessel had become whole, filled not with possessions or achievements, but with purpose and authentic relationship. The awakening that had begun with his son's fellowship application had blossomed into a new way of being, one aligned with the man he had always been meant to become. As the stars wheeled overhead and the stories continued, Thomas Reed, once defined by titles and acquisitions, now known by his contributions and connections, felt the final pieces of his fragmented self reunite in quiet wholeness. The path ahead would hold challenges, certainly, but he would face them as his truest self, fully awake to the profound simplicity of what actually matters, how we treat each other, how we use our gifts, how we participate in the healing of our shared world. In that moment of clarity beneath the Kenyan stars, surrounded by his son and a community united in purpose, Thomas finally understood that the greatest transformation was not changing into someone new, but remembering who he had been all along, and having the courage to become that person again.